Here you go, boss. As expected. It's got the file and everything.
Hello, loyal listeners. It's Roberta Felton here. Today I have the environmental researcher Christopher and psychologist James here with me to discuss the psychological impacts of solitary confinement and how this affects violent crime. Solitary confinement has increased in steady deployment across the United States, but research regarding its morality, practicality, and effectiveness has brought the usage of solitary confinement into question.
Despite studies existing that show psychological distress is apparent in those who have experienced solitary confinement, its use has increased significantly in recent decades. Haney 1.
Despite solitary confinement abolitionist arguments that since there has been a significant decrease in crime between the 1990s and current times, shown by a report written by John Gramish, director at Pew Research Center in Greenwich, the use of solitary confinement should go down. It stayed the same for the majority of the 21st century. Thus, the government maintains a solitary confinement system for its supposed effectiveness on crime rates.
Studies into the psychological and physical impact of restrictive housing on prisoners report that they often develop behavioral issues that increase their risk of crime relapse. Alongside the potential immorality of its continuation, solitary confinement also economically taxes government funds. For example, each solitary confinement prisoner could cost around $60,000 annually, which is around triple the average cost of a regular prisoner. James and Mango 6.
Despite claims that the usage of solitary confinement is largely effective in reducing violent crime due to allegedly discouraging inmates from repeating previous infractions by physically and mentally degrading them, solitary confinement is only effective to a minor extent as its environmental conditions tend to cause prisoners to develop mental disorders that increase the risk of relapsing into crime. In addition, solitary confinement also fails to facilitate rehabilitation by psychologically damaging prisoners by creating SHU syndrome.
So, Chris, could you elaborate more on the point about environmental conditions affecting these prisoners?
Yes, Candace Byrne, a writer for the newspaper Truth Out, has performed research finding the prevalence of environmental contaminants in prisons across the United States in the 21st century. Her paper reports observing facilities dealing with air pollution with concerningly high concentrations of contaminants, such as heavy metals and minerals, including mercury, lead, and arsenic. Byrne 20. A study done in one Texan prison in 2011 revealed the presence of arsenic within its water supply was around 3 times the maximum limit of acceptable arsenic. Byrne 22. These conditions of this prison reflect the national trend of prisoners in solitary confinement and their exposure to carcinogens and other harmful chemicals.
That's interesting, but how does that connect to violent crime?
David O. Carpenter and Rick Nevin, researchers at the Institute for Health and the Environment at the University of Albany, examined a few environmental causes of violence in their paper. They found that children exposed to lead in their childhoods were likelier to have lower IQ scores. These IQ scores, especially those within the bottom 5%, were found to be linked to greater chances of committing violent crime after a lag time. Carpenter and Nevin 264.
So there's a clear link between the contaminants in solitary confinement prison cells and an increased likelihood of committing crimes in the future. I believe that Carpenter and Nevin would find the prison cell conditions Byrne describes to be ineffective in reducing violent crime. These people are likely to commit crimes due to their brain physiology being altered, although this may be less extreme because they were exposed to these conditions in adulthood. I'd also like to point out that despite these arguments, a certain population still believes that solitary confinement is useful. They believe that the physical and mental states of the prisoners after being released from solitary confinement will inspire good behavior. Specifically, Alina Vanko and Kayla James, experienced authors for the Vera Institute of Justice, find that corrections practitioners believe that solitary confinement is effective due to harshly punishing and deterring those who commit acts of misconduct and violence from repeating their offenses. James and Vanko 5.
Fair point, Roberta, but how exactly does solitary punishment deter these prisoners from repeating violent behavior?
Well, Dr. Robert G. Morris, a criminologist and professor at the University of Dallas, acknowledges that a subset of the population believes that solitary confinement is an effective method. He contends that 2005 studies hypothesized that prisoners in solitary confinement were likely to experience lethargy, apathy, and chronic fatigue after release, which could reduce the odds of reoffending behavior, Morris 2. Still, a controlled experiment performed by Morris in 2006 showed that short-term solitary confinement did not impact the likelihood of a future violent act being committed, Morris 20.
Wow, looks like the different studies have conflicting theories. I like to point out that the studies done by Morris seem to be more credible since he had a larger sample size of almost 4,000 inmates. The studies he cites do not include the results of an observational or controlled experiment. They're simply making an educated guess. While Morris has data to show that time to solitary confinement shows no correlation to reduced violent behavior after the release, therefore I'm not sure how credible the arguments of those who advocate for the use of solitary confinement are. Similarly, the arguments of the corrections Practitioners that are described by Benko and James are only beliefs. They have no evidence to support their claim, and these punitive measures are fruitful.
Now, let's address how the nature of solitary confinement can psychologically drive prisoners to reoffend.
Alongside the numerous environmental conditions prisoners face in solitary confinement facilities, they likely will develop the behavioral issues from the nature of forced social isolation. Greg Haney, an expert on capital punishment and solitary confinement, reported that many studies found distressing mental effects caused by solitary confinement.
What possible psychological effects in solitary confinement conditions could create such lasting and significant behavioral issues are prevalent?
Some of these stressors Haney reported include the infamous SHU syndrome, derived from a 2016 study around the psychological impact of a California solitary confinement prison. The SHU prisoners reported the concerning effects of impulsivity, overstimulation, anxiety, and other disorders during their imprisonment. Haney 373.
I would like to reaffirm these conclusions as the environmental research from Carpenter and Nevin support how these behavioral issues can create reoffending behavior, despite being focused around lower intelligence causing these issues.
As a result of these lasting psychological damages solitary confinement prisoners are exposed to, their capability to reintegrate into society after their release is significantly decreased. Alongside solitary confinement prisoners, deprivation of social contact and positive environmental stimulation. 8366. Solitary confinement facilities also lack education, medical treatment, and support systems. James and Benko 5. These conditions force prisoners to adapt in ways that are asocial and ultimately psychologically harmful. 8373. Therefore, by further restricting prisoners' opportunities to rehabilitate themselves, solitary confinement's nature drives prisoners to reoffending behavior after their release from prison. James and Benko 5. These studies from Haney and Vera ultimately conclude that the conditions of solitary confinement result in lasting psychological stressors that prevent the possibility of the reintegration of prisoners.
So, to conclude, while solitary confinement has been promoted as a tool for reducing violent crimes, its effectiveness is minimal at best. The extreme built environmental conditions can lead to severe psychological consequences, such as SHU syndrome, which not only hinders inmates' rehabilitation but also increases the likelihood of relapsing in crime.
Wow, nicely said. To build onto you, the harmful environmental conditions of solitary confinement facilities significantly increase the likelihood of reoffending behavior. Therefore, although people will disagree, I believe that solitary confinement is effective to a minimal extent when it comes to reducing crime in the 21st century due to the harmful psychological impacts it has on prisoners.
Well, there you have it, guys. I hope everyone enjoyed listening. Stay safe and out of prison.